The moment she said, "I'm calling the police," I knew this wasn't going to be a normal conversation. It started like most HOA encounters do, with her walking up our driveway like she had somewhere important to be, except that somewhere was clearly our front door. I had just finished unloading groceries when I saw her approaching, clipboard in hand, expression already set like she had decided the outcome before even speaking. "You need to sign this," she said, holding out a stack of papers without even introducing herself. I didn't take them. "Sign what?" I asked. "HOA compliance agreement," she replied, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. "Your property has been flagged as non-compliant, and this will bring you into the system." I glanced at the papers, but didn't move. "We're not part of your HOA," I said calmly. That should have ended it. But it didn't. Her expression tightened immediately. "Yes, you are," she said. "This entire area falls under our jurisdiction." I shook my head slightly. "No, it doesn't. We checked before buying. This property is outside your HOA." She let out a short laugh, the kind people use when they think you're the one who's confused. "That's not how it works," she said. "You don't just get to opt out." "I didn't opt out," I replied. "I was never in." That's when the tone changed. What started as confident turned into irritated. "Look," she said, tapping the papers, "you're already in violation. If you sign this, we can resolve it quickly. If you don't, it escalates." I leaned against the truck for a second, studying her. "Escalates to what?" I asked. "Fines, enforcement, legal action if necessary," she said without hesitation. I almost smiled. "For rules I never agreed to?" "For rules that apply to this community," she shot back. I pointed around us. "This isn't your community," I said. That's when she took a step closer, lowering her voice like that would somehow make her more convincing. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," she said. "Just sign the agreement." "No," I said. Simple, clear, final. And that single word seemed to hit harder than anything else I could have said, because now she didn't have cooperation. She had resistance. "You don't get to say no," she replied sharply. I looked at her for a second, then said something that made everything worse for her. "Watch me." There was a brief silence, the kind where both sides realize the conversation has officially turned into something else. Then she straightened up, pulled her phone out, and tapped on it quickly. "Fine," she said. "If you won't cooperate, I'll have this handled properly." I already knew what that meant, but I still asked. "Handled how?" She looked up from her phone. "I'm calling the police." That was the moment it crossed from annoying to ridiculous. "You're calling the police," I repeated, "because I won't sign HOA paperwork?" "Yes," she said. "You're refusing lawful compliance." I let out a slow breath, trying not to laugh. "Go ahead," I said. "Call them." That wasn't the reaction she expected. Not even close. Most people would argue more, push back, try to avoid escalation. But I didn't. I just stood there, calm, waiting. And that seemed to throw her off more than anything else. Still, she made the call. I could hear her side of the conversation clearly. She described it like I was some kind of problem resident refusing to follow regulations, like this was a standard enforcement situation. She didn't mention that we weren't part of the HOA. She didn't mention that there was no agreement. Just selective information, presented with confidence. When she hung up, she looked at me like she had just secured a win. "They're on their way," she said. I nodded. Good. That word again. Good. Because now, this wasn't just her claim anymore. It was about to be tested. We waited in silence for a few minutes. She stood near the edge of the driveway, arms crossed again, while I stayed where I was. The tension was there, but it wasn't chaotic. It was controlled. Like both of us knew something was about to happen. We just didn't agree on what the outcome would be. Then we heard it. Sirens, getting closer. Within a few minutes, a patrol car pulled up in front of the house. 2 officers stepped out, looking between both of us as they approached. "Afternoon," one of them said. "What seems to be the issue?" She stepped forward immediately, like she had been waiting for this exact moment. "He's refusing to comply with HOA regulations," she said. The officer blinked once. "Okay. And?" "He won't sign the agreement," she added. "And he's ignoring violations." The second officer looked at me. "Sir?" I kept it simple. "I'm not part of their HOA," I said. There was a brief pause, because that changed everything. The first officer looked back at her. "Is that correct?" he asked. She didn't hesitate. "No," she said. "He is." I almost smiled. Because now, it wasn't about opinions anymore. It was about proof. And that's when the front door opened behind me. I turned slightly and saw my wife step outside, holding something in her hand. She had been inside the whole time, listening, waiting, not rushing into the situation. But now that the police were here, she stepped forward calmly, without saying anything at first. The officers noticed her immediately. and so did Karen. "What's this about?" my wife asked, her tone calm but direct. "They're claiming we're under their HOA," I said. My wife nodded once, then looked at the officers. "We're not," she said. Karen crossed her arms again. "You are within the jurisdiction." That's when my wife raised her hand slightly, not aggressively, just enough to stop her. "Before we continue," she said, reaching into her pocket, "you might want to see this." She held up an ID. Not quickly, not dramatically, just steady. But the moment Karen saw it, everything changed. Because her expression didn't just shift, it froze. Completely. The moment my wife held up her ID, the entire tone of the situation shifted, but not in a loud or dramatic way. More like a quiet reset where everyone suddenly realized they needed to pay closer attention. She didn't wave it around or make a scene, she just held it steady long enough for the officers to see it clearly, then lowered it slightly while maintaining eye contact. One of the officers stepped a little closer, his expression changing from routine to focused. "Ma'am," he said, "can I take a look at that?" She nodded and handed it over without hesitation. He examined it carefully, not rushing, not skimming, actually reading it. The second officer leaned in slightly, catching a glimpse, and that was enough for him too. Neither of them said anything for a few seconds, but the silence spoke louder than anything else. Then the first officer handed it back. "Understood," he said quietly. That one word changed everything. Because now this wasn't just a disagreement between a homeowner and an HOA representative. Now there was context, authority, and credibility that couldn't be brushed aside with confident claims or made-up jurisdiction zones. Karen saw it too. I watched her closely, and for the first time since she walked onto my driveway, she didn't look certain. Her posture shifted just slightly, her shoulders tightening, her expression losing that edge of control she had been holding onto since the beginning. "What is that supposed to mean?" she asked, trying to regain ground. My wife didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "It means," she said calmly, "you're making claims you can't support." Karen shook her head quickly. "We have records," she said. "This property is within our enforcement boundary." The first officer turned toward her. "Ma'am, do you have documentation showing that this property is part of the HOA?" She hesitated. Not long, but long enough. "We've issued notices," she said. "That's not what I asked," he replied. That small correction hit harder than anything else so far. Because now the conversation was being controlled by facts, not confidence. "I can get the records," she said. The second officer nodded. "That would be helpful." There it was again. Not agreement, not support, just a request for proof. And she didn't have it with her. I stepped forward slightly, not aggressively, just enough to stay part of the conversation. "We have our documentation inside," I said. "Property deed, survey, everything." The first officer looked at me. "That would help clarify things," he said. I nodded and went inside, grabbing the folder I had already gone through when we bought the place. I brought it back out and handed it over, watching as they flipped through it carefully. This wasn't rushed. This wasn't casual. They were actually verifying details. Karen stood there, arms crossed again, but it wasn't the same posture as before. This time it looked more like she was holding herself together rather than asserting control. After a minute or so, one of the officers paused on the survey map. He traced the boundary lines with his finger, then looked up. "This property is clearly outside the HOA limits," he said. That was it. Simple, direct, final. Karen immediately shook her head. "That's not correct," she said. "The boundary extends further." "It doesn't," he interrupted, still calm but firmer now. "Not based on this." She opened her mouth to argue again, but nothing came out right away, because now she had a problem. Not a disagreement, a contradiction. And the more she pushed, the worse it would look. "This needs to be reviewed," she said finally, her voice not as strong as before. "It already has been," I replied. The second officer closed the folder and handed it back to me. "From what we're seeing," he said, "there's no indication that you're under HOA authority." I nodded. "That's what we've been saying." Karen looked between all of us, like she was trying to find a way to pull the situation back under control, but there wasn't one. Every angle she had relied on before was gone. No authority, no assumption, no leverage. "You can't just ignore community standards," she said, but even that sounded weaker now. My wife stepped forward slightly, her tone still calm. "We're not part of your community," she said. "That's the point." Silence followed, because there was nothing left to argue. The officers exchanged a brief look, then the first one spoke again. "Ma'am," he said to Karen, "this appears to be a civil misunderstanding, but based on the documentation, you don't have enforcement authority here." That was the closest thing to a final ruling she was going to get in that moment. And it hit. Hard. Because now it wasn't just us saying it, it was them. Officially. Karen's expression tightened, but she didn't argue further. She couldn't. Not without evidence, and she didn't have any. "This isn't over," she said, but it didn't carry the same weight anymore. My wife looked at her for a second, then said something simple. "It already is." That ended it. The officers wrapped things up quickly after that, giving both sides a brief explanation of what they had concluded, though it was clear where things stood. When they left, the tension that had been building since the start finally broke. Karen stayed for a moment longer, standing there like she was deciding whether to say something else. But she didn't. She turned and walked away without another word. And for the first time since this started, she didn't come back. At least not right away. Because people like her don't just disappear when they lose once. They regroup, they rethink, they try again. And judging by the look on her face as she left, this wasn't the last move she was planning to make. For 2 days after that, everything went quiet. No visits, no notices, no sudden appearances at the edge of our driveway. At first, it almost felt like it was over, like the situation had resolved itself the moment the officers confirmed what we had been saying from the beginning. But I knew better. People who push that hard don't just stop because they're proven wrong once. They stop because they're forced to. And she hadn't been forced yet. So when the letter showed up on the third morning, I wasn't surprised. It was placed neatly in our mailbox, official-looking, stamped with the HOA's name, and formatted like something meant to carry authority. I opened it inside, read through it once, then handed it to my wife without saying anything. She read it more carefully than I did, taking her time with each line, then looked up. "They're trying again," she said. I nodded. "Different angle," I replied. The letter didn't claim we were members anymore. That part was gone. Instead, it focused on something else entirely. Community impact compliance. It argued that even properties outside the HOA could be subject to certain standards if they affected the neighborhood's appearance or value. I actually smiled when I read that part. Because now they were reaching. Not enforcing. Reaching. "They don't have anything," I said. "They're trying to create something," my wife replied. That was exactly it. When authority fails, some people try to rewrite the rules instead of accepting the outcome. Later that afternoon, she showed up again. But this time, she didn't come alone. 2 other HOA board members were with her, both quieter, both watching more than speaking. They stopped at the edge of our property, just like before, but there was a noticeable difference in how they carried themselves. Less confidence, more caution. I stepped outside before they could knock. "We need to discuss compliance," she said, holding up a copy of the letter. I leaned against the doorframe. "We already did," I replied. One of the board members stepped forward slightly, his tone more measured than hers. "Sir, we're not claiming you're part of the HOA," he said. "This is about maintaining community standards that affect surrounding properties." I nodded slowly. "And you think that gives you authority here?" "It gives us grounds to address issues that impact the neighborhood," he said. My wife stepped outside beside me. "Show us where that's legally defined," she said. That question landed exactly where it needed to. Because once again, they didn't have an answer. The board member hesitated, glancing at Karen briefly before responding. "It's part of our internal guidelines," he said. My wife shook her head slightly. "Internal guidelines don't apply to external properties," she replied. Silence. Again. Because this wasn't about confidence anymore. It was about proof. And they didn't have it. Karen stepped forward, clearly trying to regain control of the situation. "You're affecting property values," she said. "That gives us the right to intervene." I looked at her for a moment, then said something simple. "No, it doesn't." She opened her mouth to argue again, but my wife spoke first this time, her tone still calm but firmer. "You've already been told by law enforcement that you have no authority here," she said. "Continuing this could create a different kind of problem for you." That was the shift. Subtle, but powerful. Because now, for the first time, the risk wasn't on us. It was on them. The board members felt it immediately. I could see it in the way they exchanged another quick glance, the same silent communication as before. They weren't backing her the way she expected. "Maybe we should review this further," one of them said quietly. Karen turned toward him, clearly frustrated. "We already have," she said. "Not enough," he replied. That was it. That was the moment everything finally collapsed. Because once the people behind her stopped supporting her, there was nothing left. No authority, no pressure, no control, just one person pushing something that didn't exist. We're done here, the second board member said, more firmly this time. Karen didn't respond right away. She just stood there, looking between all of us, like she was trying to find one last angle, one last argument, one last way to turn things back in her favor. But there wasn't one, not anymore. Without another word, the board members turned and walked back toward the street. After a second, she followed, but slower this time, like she was still processing how quickly everything had fallen apart. That was the last time she came to our property. A week later, we heard what happened next. There had been a meeting. Closed. Internal. And by the end of it, she wasn't in charge anymore. No announcement, no explanation, just replaced. Because even the HOA understood something she didn't. Authority only works when it's real, and once it's challenged with facts, with proof, with something undeniable, it doesn't bend, it breaks. As for us, everything went back to normal. No more letters, no more visits, no more attempts to claim control over something that was never theirs. Just our home, the way it was meant to be. Ours, completely. And every now and then, I'd think back to that moment in the driveway when she said, "You don't get to say no." Because in the end, that's exactly what we did. How did you like the story? Please comment and like, subscribe, and share my YouTube for more interesting videos.